As we reported earlier, Education Secretary William Bennett joined President Reagan today in releasing a report about what works, as they see it, in public education.
The average American mother spends 30 minutes with her child, and mother 15, father 5. That's not enough. That's not good enough. And we have said over and over again that parents are their children's first educators.
Making the decision is the hardest part. Making the decision to go against what is known, a known thing for everybody. You want it to be the norm for your children, not the aberration. If I had to be one of the first to do it, so be it. For my children, I would have walked through fire.
Homeschooling was first brought to our attention in 1982 when a friend suggested that we think about homeschooling our oldest child, who was 3 years old at the time, rather than put him in early preschool. So we researched, investigated, and very shortly after that decided to homeschool. It also helped to read a book by Raymond Moore called Better Late Than Early, which really cemented the decision in our minds that it was an excellent idea.
Raymond Moore was sort of the granddaddy of homeschooling, of the modern homeschool movement. He had written a couple of books, and he had some definite ideas, and it was his ideas that formed the basis of how people began homeschooling their children. And the idea that you can do this, and it's something that the average parent can do. So he brought that idea to the public forum.
We lived in an excellent school district in that it had excellent academic standards. But our issue in homeschooling wasn't purely academics. It was more out of religious conviction. We wanted to pass on to our children our Christian faith, our biblical values and standards. And that cannot be done in the public school anymore.
For celebrations, there was a real push toward taking any Christian content out of the public schools. As an example, they could sing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, but they couldn't sing Away in the Manger. And so that started to bother us a little bit.
We decided to homeschool not really based on running from something. We knew we were not going to have our children in the public schools because in the Dallas Independent School District in the early 80s, they were busing the children. There were all sorts of problems in the school system. The school system admitted that themselves.
The public schools were not teaching old math. They were teaching new math, and kids were graduating not knowing their multiplication tables. They were not teaching phonics. Children were graduating from high school illiterates. They were beginning to trash the American founding fathers and American history and giving our children a bad view of our heritage.
There was sex education going on in the schools. In many cases, the parents weren't being informed as to what was being taught in those classes. They were taught under the guise of health.
Richardson prided itself because it was a progressive school district. And what I soon learned about progressive meant more value-changing subjects rather than education or academic teachings.
We homeschooled because we wanted to spend the maximum amount of time with our own children, to be able to have the fullest impact as possible with our kids, as opposed to sending them out somewhere else to be educated, so that we could incorporate our values into our own children rather than someone else's.
Our oldest son was not being taught how to read, and they were going to hold him back from between kindergarten and first grade. And I knew that he was not behind in that. He just wasn't being taught properly, so I taught him at home during the summer. And when he came back to enter the first grade, they tested him, and he was reading on the 5th grade level. I knew of no one homeschooling when I started. I just taught more or less like public schools did, or private schools.
none of us really knew, were we supposed to be producing school at home? Were you supposed to have a schoolroom with blackboards and the alphabet around the top? What was required to set an environment for education? And we sort of had to muddle through that, to morph through it, find out, and each family did it differently. So that was some part of the beauty of it.
When we started homeschooling, there was no homeschool curriculum around. We mothers had to scavenge. We started at the public libraries and checked lots of books out. We went to used bookstores. We went to garage sales. Sometimes we could find mail order catalogs from Christian textbook publishers, and we would order a few books from them. Many times we had to make our own materials.
Publishers of curriculum refused to sell to homeschoolers. We were not legitimate. They did not recognize us as a school, and so we could not get their curriculum. So we had to create our own.
The kids maybe didn't know it, but school went on 24 hours a day. We'd take a trip, and I'd point out things along the way.
Vacations were one of the things that were a natural opportunity to teach for homeschoolers. We learned early on, you don't go on vacation in the summer. And Jessica would always take at least 100 books, and she would read on the way Bridie of the Grand Canyon when we were headed west, or she'd read about the Constitution when we were going to Washington, D.C.
That was education. Everything is education.
The compulsory attendance laws of Texas, in a nutshell, require that children within a certain minimum age to a certain maximum age have to be either in public school or a private school that teaches good citizenship and is taught in the English language.
I think that the children had been out of school for about 2 weeks, and their absence was noticed. So one morning I had received a knock at the door from the truant officer, and when I answered the door, he asked me specifically if I was aware that the children were in violation of the Texas state truancy law. And I told him that we had enrolled our children in a private school, and to the understanding of the law that I had, we were within the legal rights that we had as parents to teach our children at home. And he told me that was not the case, that I needed to put the children back into school, or the Richardson School District would seek charges against us.
The Short case, Steve and Barbara Short, were prosecuted because they were highly, highly visible. Nice, photogenic, all-American family. Steve Short was a Dallas policeman. I think he was a deacon in his Baptist church. 3 photogenic daughters, middle of the school year. And so it was like waving a red flag in front of the bull for them to jerk their kids out like that all of a sudden. And the school district just felt like they had to take a stand.
Never before, never after had we ever considered that we would violate the law. Steve being a police officer, we felt that it was not only our responsibility as parents, but in order to set the example that you respect authority, we wanted our children to understand that we nor they had ever violated the law. When the truant officer came in the second time, he didn't, he wasn't actually threatening, but he let me know that this was not the education that would be best for the children. He didn't want me to feel encouraged by my actions.
The state, the TEA, was saying homeschools were not a private school, but they weren't saying how much was enough. What did you have to do to be a private school? They weren't explaining that. And the basic core idea of vagueness is, constitutional vagueness is, that unless the statute itself specifically tells you what to do, and if you can't know how much is enough, the statute is unconstitutionally vague as applied to you.
I was nervous going to court the first day. The setting is unusual. I had never been in court before. I had, believe it or not, never even as much as gotten a traffic ticket. So I felt very out of my element.
The first day we went to hearing on our vagueness defense, Judge Patsy denied our motion to dismiss and found the Shorts guilty of truancy. And we walked out of court, and there was all the cameras and CBS Evening News and all this massive publicity about being the losers. The next day, he called and said he'd looked at my brief and he looked at those cases and he thought we were right, so he was going to dismiss the case. They didn't put us back on CBS Evening News after that. Life's just not fair sometimes.
When we began to homeschool, homeschooling was definitely an aberration from the normal.
One of my dear friends said to me, "I hate it that you're not going to be part of our group anymore." And I was just stunned. But what she meant was, you're not part of the school community anymore, and so therefore you don't exist. So that was the attitude of many people, is that we just didn't exist and couldn't be their friends anymore because of the route we had taken.
I would say in the earliest days we were politely tolerated by other people. They knew we weren't truly strange, but they thought what we were doing was very different. They wondered if it was legal. They wondered if it was proper.
We homeschoolers were perceived as religious crazies, even by some people in our churches. We were odd ducks. People did not understand why we were committed to doing what we were doing.
You were looked at, even by friends, with suspicion. Why are you doing this? And most people felt judged immediately. If you chose to homeschool, what are you saying about their choice to send their child to school?
I think the public perception of homeschoolers, even throughout the 80s, was people who are not qualified to teach their children. People that may not even have a college education, or the kids are not being adequately socialized. Those were the two things that I always got hit with.
This Friday, the first of 5 families will be tried for removing their children from public schools in Katy and teaching them at home. The charge is truancy, but the parents say home education is their God-given right.
About 1981, the Texas Education Agency, that we refer to as TEA, issued a directive to all of the school districts in Texas indicating that homeschooling had to comply with certain requirements in order to be legal. And there were 3 basic requirements, as I recall. The school had to have a certified teacher, had to have a state-approved curriculum, and students from more than one family. So as a result of that directive, that basically meant that about 99.9% of the homeschool families couldn't qualify. And we never could figure out what the basis in the law was for that directive, but that was sent out to the school districts. And as a result of that, many of them began prosecuting homeschool families for violating compulsory school attendance laws.
Essentially, the establishment education group, they seem to be threatened by homeschooling. And I think that's where the step up took place of prosecutions to try to squelch and shut down this homeschooling movement and really demotivate people out of fear. They would be afraid to homeschool because of the potential of prosecution.
The law had been the same for 59 years, since 1923, and all of a sudden they decided they were going to advise the school districts of the state of Texas to go after homeschoolers as not being in private school and therefore in violation of the truancy laws.
We lived with a very real fear that not only could we be prosecuted for truancy, given jail sentences and stiff fines, but that Child Protective Services could get involved and take our children from us. That was the worst nightmare that we lived with.
There were actual cases where people were jailed or threatened with jail. And the fact that that was not permitted by law didn't seem to faze these judges. And stories like that were spread around and people were afraid, and there was a legitimate reason for them to be afraid.
Susan Starnes reports tonight that Houston area school districts are prosecuting more families for running home schools than districts in any other part of the country.
Mark and Gail Simpson clung to each other for support as the judge decided whether they'd have to stand trial for teaching their son at home the lessons other kids learn in schoolrooms.
When the prosecutions of homeschoolers began in the early 1980s, obviously homeschoolers were concerned about having their names associated with homeschooling. And in many cases, when homeschoolers got together, they didn't want their names on a mailing list or anything else that could be printed where the school district could find out about them.
Some families chose to go underground, and they maybe changed churches and never told anybody that they were homeschooling and didn't want to be associated with any part of the movement. Of course, at that time, there weren't any support groups or anything to speak of, and so if you wanted to go underground, it was pretty easy.
We made sure that during the daytime hours our children were not playing in the front yard. We didn't go to the grocery store or to the department store during school hours because we didn't want people asking us, well, why aren't your children in school? Or where do they go to school?
In the beginning, this was not a warm, fuzzy environment where everybody loved homeschooling. It was quite hostile. Our own children were stopped when they were at the rec center playing basketball and picked up by the police and then brought home. So it was a real danger of your children being looked at as truant.
There was a possibility that we might be put to the test or forced to make a decision to either give up homeschooling or either lose our children or go to jail as a result of it.
My husband and I were in a fortunate position in that we're both attorneys. We felt better equipped to deal with this nightmare, but it was still very real. Attorneys still can be arrested, they can still go to jail, they can still have their children taken away from them. We spent a lot of time on our knees praying to the Lord to give us wisdom and skill to deal with these challenges.
It just seems so contrary to what our founding fathers had in mind with our whole country and what it was based on, the freedoms it was based on, the freedom of choice, of choosing to educate your children the way you like.
The 5-man, 1-woman jury sided with the state, which argued a home setting cannot be considered a private or parochial school.
The law is not specific enough in that point to warrant the conclusion that the jury has come to.
All 6 parents say they will continue to teach their children at home while their case is on appeal, a case they say they are prepared to take all the way to the Supreme Court.
Nobody was winning. About half of the lawsuits were being won by the districts and half were being won by the parents.
The courts at this time don't have anything to hang its hat on, so to speak, in regards to what is a private school. It hasn't been defined.
Some of the justices of the peace that we ran into in some of the early years when homeschoolers were taken to court by the school district were not lawyers and really weren't used to these kind of cases, who just said, well, we don't want to hear about what's going on at home. You can't possibly have a school at home. Is this kid in school? Meaning in a building, in a public school with other kids around with a bell and recess and school buses.
After the short trial brought tremendous publicity on the subject of homeschooling and our telephones were ringing off the wall, Barbara and I decided it would really be a good idea to have a meeting and invite anybody who wanted to come to learn more about homeschooling. We found a sympathetic church in Cedar Hill, Texas, and held our first homeschool meeting in October of 1982.
It was just amazing to me how quickly the interest grew and how many parents were so willing to take up the cause and teach their children at home.
We began publishing the Texas Home Educators newsletter in January of 1983 because homeschool families were in desperate need of reliable information.
Well, the newsletter was the first of its kind for homeschoolers in Texas to really provide information from a central organization.
We kept receiving phone calls with families asking the same questions over and over again. There was so much information that needed to be disseminated, we finally put together a handbook which contained the answers to all of their questions. We had to disseminate a great deal of legal information, so we had articles in the handbook on that. They wanted to know where to find curriculum. We listed all the curriculum suppliers that we knew of. They wanted to know where to find local support groups, We had a directory of support groups in there. They wanted to know good answers they could give their mother-in-laws who were worried about what they were doing. And it was a great, great weapon to arm them and prepare them and equip them for homeschooling.
I invited Dr. Moore down to speak in the Dallas area, and we discussed having a national meeting. We decided this event would be called the 20th Century Pioneers, and that it would be held at the Anatole, and I believe it was July of 1983. Well, it had several purposes: to unify the homeschoolers, to give them strength in numbers concept to the public and to them, because a lot of them were so isolated, to network, to build a network that would be national, and to give practical information as well. Phyllis Schlafly was one of the speakers. We opened the doors, and she just, where did all these people come from? She says, I have never seen so many people in my life for something like this. She says, most of the groups I speak to are very small. They're small enough to meet in homes, and maybe just 10 or 12 will come.
After so much hostility, so much isolation, dealing with such small meetings, to see so many people there, I was thrilled. The atmosphere was charged with excitement. Other people were feeling the same thing. We were very encouraged, and it gave us the strength to move on.
In pulling together there, we for the first time began to see ourselves as a group. Before that, we were just individuals who were choosing to do something that was countercultural.
It was the most interesting case of spontaneous combustion, so to speak, that I've ever seen. Little fires starting everywhere. After a while, we would hear of another family or two that were homeschooling in our area. We would get together with them. Our children would start playing together. Sometimes we would co-teach a subject or do a science experiment together. Then we would decide to go places, go to parks, have picnics, go visit museums, art galleries. It just grew. These little knots of 3, 4, and 5 families would grow. They'd find other little groups. They'd start joining together.
We would have loved to have been able to get together homeschool baseball teams during the day. But for the fact that we were really trying to stay out of sight, out of mind, we weren't able to pursue those activities that we thought would be a lot of fun if we could get the homeschool kids together, not only for the parents, but for the sake of the kids as well. But the fact that we felt like we needed to be a little bit more discreet kept us inside probably more than we would like to have been.
There were several reasons that homeschoolers came together, the first being legal protection and legal unity. The next reason would be that they needed curriculum, so they shared that. And then the third reason was they needed support. And this is how support groups were born and co-ops were born.
We began realizing there were some subjects we were having difficulty teaching: art, music, science labs, advanced math. And so we decided to start homeschool co-ops within the support groups, where those of us who were trained in these subjects would teach the other children.
We found our needs met just with the few families we were co-oping with. Pulling together, though, gave the families a sense of unity, and it gave them a sense of knowing that they could use one another's strengths, just like in a church. When people work together to do the work of the church, we were working together to do the work of the homeschooling movement.
There were so many truancy prosecutions that we had to get organized just to defend ourselves. We had no champions anywhere. Our churches were not supportive of us. The legislature was not, and the TEA certainly was not. So we had to organize and learn to lobby. We had to learn to communicate with our legislators.
The earliest efforts that I can recall was to try to get homeschooling specifically mentioned in Texas law, because it was not mentioned. under the compulsory attendance statute. And so the initial effort was to try to approach the legislature and say, go ahead and provide for homeschooling.
There was so much hostility in the Texas legislature to homeschooling that we desperately needed a lobbying tool that would put in a nutshell what was good about homeschooling and why it was constitutional and legal. So we put together a little booklet called Homeschooling, Is It Working? It was an easy read, and it was perfect for legislators and mother-in-laws who tended to be our most hostile people. So it was a great little booklet. We sold probably 15,000 copies in the first 2 years of its publication. And actually it was sold all over the United States because nobody had produced a lobbying tool yet, and it was very needed.
At that point in time, people who were homeschooling or wanting to homeschool really didn't have an established lobby with legislators. If it was going to happen, if representation was going to take place, we knew that we were going to have to do it ourselves, even though we ourselves had no real experience in doing this type of thing.
There are no bills before the legislature that would define private school. Tarrant County State Representative Jan McKenna has introduced a bill which would allow parents to keep their kids out of public schools on religious grounds, but makes no attempts to clarify the private school question.
You must get very well acquainted with your legislators. Take your children. We want your face to be the one they see in their mind's eye when anybody tries to lower the compulsory age or tries to down and talk down homeschools and say how bad they are. Because if they meet your children, they'll find out the truth, and then they won't want to. They'll want to hear what you have to say. And I think I told them to take cookies and things like that too. A little bribery never hurts.
In 1983, Governor Mark White appointed Ross Perot to chair the SCOPE Committee, which was the Select Committee on Public Education. This was to investigate the public school system and recommend reforms.
But there was, in essence, a crisis in public education in Texas at that time, and no one could figure out why. The state was spending more and more money with no results to show for it. So basically, the committee looked at all aspects of the public education system and determined how it could be improved.
So I wrote a letter to Ross Perot, and a few days or a week later, I got a telephone call at home, and it was Ross Perot. And then he says, well, what do you think we ought to do about public education? It's in a terrible state. I said, the thing that we're concerned about is that you and this whole commission will come up with some idea that you're responsible for all the kids in the state, and that you'll take private schools and put them under the aegis of the state. So he told me right then, he said, I promise you that if that happens, you let me know. If there's a problem, you let me know. And I said, well, you can be sure that I will call you. And all I can say is, just trust your word.
The private schools and homeschoolers were terrified of this committee because whatever they recommended would have ramifications for us and could limit our freedoms to educate as we saw fit. And so hundreds of homeschool moms went down during those hearings and lobbied legislators, lobbied committee members. We took our children in strollers. We were down there all the time circulating around the Capitol. We were an unusual lobbying force.
And one of the recommendations of that SCOPE, as we call it, committee, was that the State Board of Education should be appointed with professionals serving rather than elected by the people.
We homeschoolers really cut our teeth on how to lobby our legislators. We got very good at buttonholing them in elevators and in hallways and making them listen to us, that we had a right to educate our children in the manner that we saw best.
We had been homeschooling about 3 weeks before the truant officer came to our door. And he was very, very nice, very polite. Said he just stopped in. It was a friendly visit. He wanted to know what we were doing, and I explained to him that we were going through Christian Liberty. He jotted that down. That, I said, we've got the books in here. We do school. I explained we school from 8 till 3, 5 days a week, and just said all the things that he wanted to hear. 5 days later, we got a letter from the school district.
They threatened us with family code violations and truancy violations if we didn't have the children. I think it was 5 days. If we didn't have them back in school in 5 days, that they would begin legal action, basically, is what the letter said.
So we started trying to find out if indeed our children were truant, if they were delinquent, if we were breaking the law. Because I had no intention of breaking the law. I just don't. And everything that my husband and I could find indicated that we were indeed not breaking the law, that we had every right to homeschool. At the same time, we were hearing about other people in different areas of the state, in other states, that were being actually arrested and taken to court because they homeschooled. It really struck fear in our hearts to think that we could be next. But we were so certain that what we were doing was the right thing. And I knew, even that early, that it was the best thing for my kids, that we had to continue. And continue we did.
The Arlington Home Educators Group had invited Shelby Sharp to come and talk to us with regarding his recommendations on how it should be approached.
I recommended that they consider trying to resolve it by filing a declaratory judgment suit. And a declaratory judgment suit is where you have two parties and you have either a statute or a contract or some type of written document that determines the rights and responsibilities. Because their rights and responsibilities are affected, it's not just an intellectual discussion, you can go into a court and ask the court to give an interpretation so that the parties know what their rights and responsibilities are. And that was what I had recommended that they consider.
At the end of his presentation, or at the end of the meeting, at the very end of it, he asked if there was anybody who would want to get involved with the lawsuit. And my wife and I kind of looked at each other and, yeah, okay.
As far as I myself felt very strongly about homeschool. And I felt that I had to do anything that would make it more comfortable for not only myself but others, that would make it easier to homeschool without fear of prosecution. There was no choice as far as I was concerned. I would have been ashamed of myself and very lax in my duty had I not followed through on that.
A class action suit is one that the final decision is going to affect more than just the actual named parties. The parties are representing themselves, but they're also representing people who are in the same legal situation. And so that's what makes up a class, where that the plaintiff member does truly stand in the same shoes of many other people who are out there.
We considered the ramifications of all this, especially because our family name being on the case, that we may, if we did not win this case, we were probably going to get crucified. they would go after us and make an example of us, I would imagine.
I wanted to be sure that the class representatives truly represented the class. I did not want it to be all one race. I wanted there to be diversity from Anglo to black to brown. I also wanted there to be diversity with respect to those who were educating at home because of academics, for those who were concerned about safety, for those who were concerned about sociological and psychological matters. I wanted to be sure that we had a complete representation of every phase of why families were educating at home.
It was quite a diverse group, but we were all drawn together because of the common need to feel comfortable homeschooling our children and wanting the best for our children.
But to have a class action, you have to have representatives for the classes. And so that's why we were putting together a class of homeschool families, homeschool providers, and then homeschools that have departments of that. Then on the other side, we were selecting districts to represent the 1,063, and that's how we selected Arlington and El Paso and Katy. They were separated by geography, and they were also different in size so that there was a legitimate representation for the 1,063 districts. I also wanted it in the 17th District Court. I wanted Judge Charles Murray to be the one to try this lawsuit because of all the state district judges that were sitting on the bench at that time. I knew there was none better than Judge Murray.
I got a call from Shelby, and because of the letters, we were the only ones that were formally threatened. Then they were going to use our name on the banner of the case, which I wasn't too crazy about because I'm kind of like the guy that wants to stand at the back, at the back of the church type of thing, and be in part of the woodwork. And throughout this whole thing, we've been thrust to the front, so to speak. Unwillingly, but thrust to the front.
After the Leeper case was filed in early 1985, we approached our friends in the state legislature who stood ready to introduce a bill if we wanted one to be introduced. And we told them that we thought it was not necessary at this time, that we'd gotten a legal opinion that the current Texas statute was sufficient to cover homeschooling, and that we were taking the matter to the courts for a decision.
I had filed the declaratory judgment suit under the Texas Declaratory Judgment Act. And when the state was asking for a continuance, one of the attorneys representing the Association of School Districts was at the hearing asking for the continuance. During that time, he and I had a private conversation outside in which he said, Shelby, he said, you have not asserted a property right in conjunction with this declaratory judgment suit. And my reading of the case law is that if there's not a property right affected, you're going to get tossed out. And I said to him, I will take a look into that and see if you're right. And I checked it out, and he was right. So it was a good thing that they asked for the continuance, because if Judge Murray had had to rule on it, I would have lost, and the case would have been over right then.
If I had realized when we signed up all that we would go through, I can't imagine not signing up. I can't imagine doing anything differently. But God in His grace allowed me not to know, because I would have been scared the whole time.
Very early on, after the lawsuit was filed, I had talked to the attorneys on the defense side, which would be primarily the Attorney General, and I asked for them to stop the prosecutions until we could get a definitive decision. Because if we won, then here were these prosecutions that were wrongly taking place. And we all were in court. We were all going to be bound by it, so let's get a decision, and in the meantime, let's stop the warfare. And they declined to do that.
I was thrilled when that case was filed. At last, we were going on the offensive. I was so tired of being on the defensive and skulking around, so to speak. I wanted to get the issue of our legality settled. I had great confidence in the people who were handling the case and great hope that this was a better strategy than trying to go through the Texas legislature, where a perfectly good bill might go into the legislature, but every possibility existed that when it came out, it would be mangled and leave us in a worse position than before.
Well, the State Board of Education, which at that time, by 1986, was an appointed board, actually tried to come up with a definition of what a private school was. And by doing that, they in essence were regulating private schooling. And they were asked to do that by the Attorney General of Texas, who at that time was Jim Maddox. And he was trying to, in essence, preempt what we were doing in the Leeper versus Arlington ISD case. And he was trying to get the board to rule on what a private school was.
They decided they were responsible for the education of every child in the state of Texas. That was an exact quote, I think. It was like waving a red flag in front of my face. I was really, really upset. And I thought, over my dead body will this happen? Or maybe over Ross Perot's dead body if he didn't keep and of course, please, figurative speech, but if he didn't keep his promise. But that's how passionate I was about it. I was not going to give up. So I went to the telephone. First person I called was Ross Perot's office. He says, we must have a meeting out here at Perot headquarters. And he said, we'll strategize. Why don't you get together 15, 20 people who are willing to help, will have some input, and we'll do it.
That first meeting was indeed at Ross Perot's office, and his attorney, who was very politically savvy, suggested that if we wanted to make an impact, that we organize an event, a rally that would alert and show politicians the fervor and the depth of feeling that people had about private and home education, particularly homeschooling in our case.
The Tea Party, or the rally, was being held around a committee meeting, an open committee meeting to the public that the TEA was putting on. During this time, they were going to take public testimony on the issue of regulating home schools.
For those of us that were organizing it, we came together as what I would call a loose coalition. Someone told someone else about me, and they asked me to come for organizational and administrative reasons.
From the time we sat down after our meeting with Ross Perot's people, we had about 3 weeks until the state board meeting would occur. One of the people of the meeting was Kirby Anderson, who himself was a fairly prominent talk show host, and he was friends with not only Marlon Maddox, but with others who had talk shows. We had no real means of promoting the rally. We had no PR people, so talk radio was to be the primary vehicle. There was no internet by which we could get the word out. So that was the primary way that we let people know what was going on, and it worked far better than we ever dreamed.
We named it the Austin Tea Party. Obviously, it has a word play on the Boston Tea Party that was held in the 1700s in our country. Well, the Austin Tea Party stood for, obviously, the city of Austin, where the hearing was being held and where legislation takes place for the state of Texas. And TEA, is the acronym for the Texas Education Agency. So what we want to try to accomplish with the rally itself was to raise public awareness, to raise the decision makers' awareness on the State Board of Education, and ultimately to be sure that homeschooling freedoms were available for us and for those who followed us.
The parallels were so perfect because this was a governing body that we did not elect, we did not have representation in, which was a lot of the complaints of our early forefathers, and yet they were going to regulate us when they had no legal right to do so. And so the parallels were so perfect that the Tea Party became the rallying cry. And it makes for good sound bites too, I'm sure.
Homeschoolers say they can do a better job of teaching their children values and academics than the public schools can. Local school districts have taken homeschoolers to court for violating compulsory attendance laws. But since state laws on private education are so vague, court decisions have been inconsistent. That may change next week when the State Board of Education tries to define exactly what a private school is. The board will be considering proposals to regulate private schools, including homeschools. And people like the Hulseys say they're heading for Austin in force to oppose the idea.
The challenge started really just as we hit Austin. And that was, at the last minute, it looked like they weren't going to permit us to set up. And that was going to be a real problem. So with a lot of phone calls, and at that time cell phones were very, very new, and I happened to have one. I was on the cell phone a lot, was able to get in contact with the head of campus security at University of Texas, and finally, and it was literally within hours prior to when the rally was to be held, we got the okay and the go-ahead to set up.
Rob Reese's involvement was really a godsend because he had things the others of us didn't have. He had financial resources, and he had a semi-truck, and he had a trailer upon which the rally was conducted. He provided a studio on wheels for the rally.
They called today's hearing the Austin Tea Party because the Texas Education Agency wants to regulate private and home schools. But these parents, most of whom educate their children at home with no regulations, have fears that go far beyond the classroom.
Our family was chosen to go out on the stage in order to lead the Pledge of Allegiance. And we were all to stand there, and our oldest child, who was about 7 at the time, was to lead it.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands.
But standing out there, watching everybody salute that flag, it was a very moving moment, having your child's voice, his little tiny voice, come over that loudspeaker system, and knowing that he was being part of something that you were doing for his future was very emotionally moving for me.
The attitude of the crowd at the Austin Tea Party, I think, was that of excitement and yet fear. It was kind of an odd mix. But I sensed that most people were there and ready to fight for what they believed in.
The weather of that day was exactly as we would not have planned. It was cold, it was rainy, people came out with umbrellas, but they came out in numbers far greater than we had expected. We were hoping for maybe 1,500, and there were about 5,000 or 6,000 people out there.
The rain held off most of the day. We had a little bit of drizzle. But it really didn't dampen the spirits of those folks that were there. And they were carrying these signs. Young children were carrying them. Parents were carrying them. And the news media was definitely filming them. There was a lot of coverage as a result.
But we were outside praying, singing, peacefully showing by our very presence that this was very important to us, that our freedoms were being trampled, that we were not going to allow a bureaucracy to come in and regulate us simply because they did not know what to do with us.
When we organized the event, we really didn't want it to be a one-sided political event, so we invited speakers from both sides, both Republican and Democrat, to participate. So this was an important time in Texas politics. It was part of the transition from the old Texas Democratic Party to the new Texas Republican Party. And Bill Clements represented the bridge between the two.
We have another Texas government agency instigated and provoked and encouraged by Governor White and Maddox to step in and enforce a bureaucratic decision on our strong family traditions of our children belong to our families. Our children are the most important single thing in our family traditions in Texas. and the education of our children are the basic building block of that family tradition for our young people.
We knew that if we had his support, we had some powerful support within the governing structure of Texas.
I was working in the semi, and fielding telephone calls from the press and from other people still wanting to testify, including Governor White. I don't know that he wanted to testify so much as he wanted to transmit his support of our position, which he had never been willing to do before that.
The rally took place outside the hall where the hearings were taking place, which happened to be at the LBJ Library, which was on the campus of the University of Texas. So we were able to set up just outside, just off of the plaza where the auditorium was.
The final auditorium that they held it in was completely filled, every seat. There was standing room only in the hallways, and there were still probably several thousand people outside in the parking lot during the hearing itself, because so many had showed up.
I think the board was surprised, shocked that there were so many people that came, that were interested in this issue.
The people feel that their faith, their religious belief, something tender and dear to them beyond description, capable for me to tell you, is literally threatened by what's happening with these proposals.
I can't let you have my children, see? And I plead with you, don't be the fall guy for Mark White.
Thank you.
Don't do his dirty work.
Thank you.
I thought it was very wise of those who were planning on speaking, because they got together, many of them from our area, and they decided who could speak best on different topics. Some could come from the direction of the legalities and the history of homeschooling in Texas. Some could come from a more practical standpoint, some from an educator's viewpoint. And so they determined who would bring what facet to the board so that we could best represent the interests of the homeschoolers.
Well, actually, I was supposed to testify before the state board that day, but I decided to yield my time to Chris Baker, Virginia Baker's son. Chris had been homeschooled by Virginia and had graduated from Texas A&M and was a successful professional at that time. So I felt like he had a really unique testimony that nobody else would be covering.
There was I would say, a strong animosity from the State Board of Education toward those who were speaking in favor of homeschooling and all. I believe the chairman himself, although gracious at times, was also aggressive at times in the way in which he questioned the speakers and so on, as were some of the other board members. But I believe as it progressed, and as they saw the support that was there, and they heard the articulation of thought and of results that were occurring with homeschooling, that it had a favorable impact on that State Board of Education.
The State Board of Education yielded a advisory opinion to the legislature. They basically admitted we don't have the authority to define private school, but we recommend that the legislature clear this up as to what is a private school and that there ought to be some type of regulation of private schools in Texas. But they were very vague about it and kind of kicked the ball over to the state legislature. So we considered it a victory.
When Shelby filed the case, in March, he said, well, we should have a court date by September or October. So with that in mind, you consider it took 2 years instead of just a couple of months. Yeah, it was a rather interminable period of time, yeah.
When we signed up, we had no idea that we would be chosen to lead the lawsuit. It was a great commitment. We had a lot of TV interviews. We had radio interviews, we had newspaper interviews. They're very time-consuming. They're very hard on you physically because of the emotional. It was what we had to do. There was no choice.
My wife did most of the media work. I was only there for maybe 1 or 2 shoots. but she was very long-suffering, let's put it that way, in dealing with with the media. And because they all wanted to take pictures of the kids homeschooling.
I like it. I'm a lot closer to my mother than I was my teacher.
They would interview each of the kids, and they would interview me. It would take an hour, maybe hour and a half, sometimes longer. And they would race off to have it on the evening news, which turned out to be a minute, maybe, of footage.
These students are learning firsthand about the legal process. Many of their parents are among those who have filed suit in an effort to keep the state from interfering with their education system. That system is called homeschooling, where the parents are the teachers and the classroom is the home. Homeschoolers claim their one-on-one teaching system is superior to public or private schools, and their children test at higher grade levels. It's their hope that the judge will declare homeschools as private schools, though, so they won't be governed by the state.
I called a little more than 20 witnesses during the course of the trial. We only had a few expert witnesses, and those were experts in home education. I brought Samuel Blumenfeld from the Boston area because he's one of the top authorities on education in the United States, including home education. Well, Samuel Blumenfeld was my lead-off witness, and he did a great job until we got to Texas. And he was not that familiar with home education in Texas, only home education at that period of time in the United States in general. And the Attorney General had some fun with Dr. Blumenfeld by asking him a question on the Alamo. And he couldn't answer the question on the Alamo. And his point was to say, look, if he doesn't even know about the Alamo, Judge Murray, this guy is not really a good witness on home education in Texas. So that's where I determined, once that happened, that I needed to bring Rushdoony in, and I was able to get him in on Wednesday. Dr. Rushdoony had also spent a considerable period of time in Texas decades before the homeschool case. He was extremely knowledgeable on the history of the compulsory attendance law. The fun part came when the cross-examination took place and he got the question on the Alamo. And at that point, Dr. Rushdoony gave Kevin O'Hanlon a history lesson that to this day, I'll bet you Kevin O'Hanlon has not forgotten it.
I was an expert witness in the Leeper versus Arlington ISD case to set the stage for some of the other expert witnesses that were going to testify on more specific matters on education.
Yeah, they tried to discredit everyone. All of our expert witnesses, the families, everybody that from our side, they tried to shoot them down.
He cross-examined me, how many homeschoolers do you really know? How many really got prosecuted? Because my basic testimony was a broad brush opinion as to what was going on in homeschooling in general. So he was trying to get me to say I really had not come in contact with that many homeschoolers. And of course I said I hadn't, that I'd probably met over 1,000 or talked to 1,000 by phone or talked to them in groups or had them ask me questions, things. I had interaction with probably 1,000 homeschoolers.
The trial was incredibly interesting because of all the expert witnesses. To see the play back and forth between our attorney and the defense attorney. It was an education in itself.
Shelby would always go into the jury room in the courtroom when the trial was going on and pray. And the one time he didn't, why, things didn't go very well. But every time he did, it was amazing how smooth this thing was.
Our children did attend the trial because it was a landmark decision. I felt that they should be there. Both Gary and I felt that this was changing the history of homeschool in Texas. We wanted them, they had been a part of it through the whole thing. They'd been the reason, that we started homeschooling.
Outside of Dr. Rushdoony's testimony, Helen Jackson's testimony will probably never depart from my mind. The testimony up before that had been to try to show that Helen Jackson, who is a black lady, really wasn't qualified to try to teach her kids at home, even though she had testified under direct examination from me that when she pulled her kids home to teach them, that they were 2 and 3 grade levels behind the public schools, and after 1 year they were 2 and 3 grade levels ahead, and how that they'd been having fusses and fights, and now the kids were getting along great, and they were the leaders in the various organizations that they were involved. But when she was asked that question about if she ever had any thought about not doing it, her answer was that she had received a letter in the mail shortly after she had begun teaching her kids at home, and it was from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration selecting her as the first lady astronaut, and she turned it down. It's interesting that almost 20 years have gone by from that trial. And that still has an emotional impact. But that room was like a nuclear bomb going off. The vast majority of people would not have turned that down. She would have gone from obscurity to the cover of Time, First Lady, First Black Lady. Totally caught me off guard. I knew she had worked at NASA. I knew she was an engineer. I believe they thought she was a cleaning lady. She'd never shared it. And still today, she remains in obscurity. Tells you a lot about Helen. I still can't figure out how that can have such an impact on me. Since January of '87. But it sure does. Now, the funny part of that, and I still laugh today about that, is after she unloaded that bombshell, I looked over at the attorneys, Kevin O'Hanlon and the attorneys for the districts, and the look on the attorneys' faces is, boy, that helped us a lot. You could tell it just blew them away. And you could tell it made a big impact on Judge Murray. I've never had a group of clients testify better than they did. I've never had a group of clients respond to cross-examination better than they did. Nothing unsettled them. They were able to give good, forthright, honest answers and not hurt the case one bit.
It was very enlightening. It was also very exhausting. When I'd go home at night, I was truly exhausted. And we'd have another day to go through and another day.
Almost every time I would leave the courtroom, I would get waylaid by either a reporter with a pencil and a pad or a film crew or something. So it was one thing or another.
For 2% of problem, they would impose regulations on the other 98%. That seems to be their approach.
Testimony in the case that will ultimately affect all Texas homeschools resumes next week. Sonia Van Sickle, Channel 8 News, Fort Worth.
The defense was not an enthusiastic defense. It was very, very apparent that they were really spouting sort of the party line about public education as compared to home education.
Kevin O'Hanlon says there are a number of situations where kids are kept at home for the wrong reasons.
Babysitting or making them go to work and things of that nature, and that there has to be a way of winnowing out or finding out those that are legitimately educating their children and those that are not.
They were looking statewide, searching every rock, under every rock, trying to find an illegal homeschool situation where someone would claim to be homeschooling and wouldn't be teaching their kids at all, but they had the kids at home so they could babysit their children, the rest of the children, so they could go to work, type of thing. Well, they never found a single case.
In a number of these cases, the primary motivation is Anglo parents not wanting their kids to go to school with minorities. Significant problem in a number of these cases.
One of the big arguments of the state during our trial was lack of proper socialization. They said that these children, homeschool children, were going to be isolated, would not have any rapport or whatever with their peers in public school, with all levels of economic opportunity, all religions, all, races, that type of thing.
The trial lasted all 5 days of the first week and ended on Wednesday of the second week. And it ended with the closing of the testimony and Judge Murray advising that he would let us know when he had made a decision. He would send us a letter and tell us what his ruling was.
The last day of the trial was a relief. It was also very scary because the answer was coming. We knew that. We knew it wouldn't be immediate, of course. But it was pins and needles. In actual time, it was only several months. But waiting for that every day, hoping we'd hear something from our attorney or from someone, it was a long time. Very long time.
The thought that was fearful for us was, if we were not successful in the Leeper case, then what? Then would it be our family in court? What would we do? What stand would we take? And those became questions that we had to ask ourselves and our family, weigh them against scriptural principles, and determine what would we do. Very tough decisions that we were facing at that point in time. A lot of prayer was going on as a result.
Well, we got a letter from Judge Murray that was several pages in length, in which he outlined his findings and his ruling. It ruled in favor of us. It found that, the compulsory attendance law included a homeschool, and that's what the language had to be, and that there should not be any prosecutions, and that a school would consist of somebody diligently pursuing a written curriculum and that it had a course of study in good citizenship.
And now Gary and Cheryl Leeper can continue teaching their children at home without fear of prosecution after winning a 2-year court battle in Fort Worth.
Of course, we said we knew it was going to happen all along, which was a lie. But it was such a relief. It was just wonderful. It felt light.
I mean, I was elated. It's always good to get a ruling that gives you everything you're asking for. But I also recognized the impact that this was going to have statewide. And I knew, because there was an injunction that you stop. It's one thing to have a judgment in your favor, but it's another thing to have a judgment that includes an injunction. Because that meant if one of those 1,063 districts out there violated that, they could be held in contempt of court. In contempt of court, judges don't like their rulings being ignored.
I think it was just put together by God. I really do. And as a result of this case, Texas has the best homeschool environment than any in the United States. Any state in the United States.
Texas Attorney General Jim Maddox disagrees with the ruling, saying Judge Murray is wrong in interpreting a homeschool as a private school. Maddox also says the ruling doesn't address the state's right to establish a curriculum in homeschools. The state may file an appeal of the decision.
The case went up on appeal. It went up on appeal over the recommendation of Kevin O'Hanlon and the attorneys for the 3 districts. They felt the decision was right, and they did not want to appeal it. And it was only because the State Board of Education insisted on an appeal that it did go up.
The appeal was not on the quality of homeschool. It was an economic thing. It was an economic issue. It was not because they didn't want to pay the court costs. That was the only reason why they appealed. They had no footing on the actual issue itself. It was only the outcome of the issue and what the state was going to have to pay.
That was scary. Here we go again. The only difference was we didn't have to testify for that. That was all just a matter of going to court. We had great faith in our attorney, in Shelby Sharp. So our burden was to pray.
The court handed down a written opinion in which the court affirmed Judge Murray in the entirety of the judgment. The case was appealed on to the Supreme Court of Texas, and the Supreme Court of Texas affirmed the lower court decisions. The decision itself only impacted the state of Texas. A state decision does not have any precedential power in another state. And so by it going up to the Intermediate Appellate Court and then ultimately on to the Supreme Court of Texas, that got a published opinion which gave it the power that it had outside of the state of Texas, even though legally you don't have to follow it in Arkansas or Louisiana or any other state. When you saw what it was about and the reasoning and what took place, it was very apparent that homeschoolers had the right to do what they were doing.
The Texas Supreme Court ruling affirming the Leeper decision was a major turning point in the history of homeschooling in Texas, because now all of a sudden homeschooling has been legitimized by the highest court in the state, and no longer would we have to hide, no longer would we have to fear prosecution, no longer would we be considered social outcasts anymore.
The Leeper opinion is probably the single most important homeschool opinion that's ever been handed down in any state or federal court. And it has probably kept more parents out of the courtroom from educating their children than any other single opinion.
Homeschooling was a real sacrifice of time, of energy, and of money. It was stressful in the beginning years because of the hostile environment that we began in. It was exhausting. It could be frustrating, but it was the most marvelous adventure I have ever had. I would do it again in a heartbeat.
We realized that it was going to be a moral, a spiritual, and a political battle that we were willing to fight to provide the freedoms for others to do the same thing that we'd experienced if they chose to do so.
We knew all along that we were fighting a battle that the Lord wanted us to fight. And that didn't always mean we were going to have victory, because many times the Lord puts His people out there in a battle that they may be losing, but there's something He wants you to learn through it. But God was very much in control, you could tell, and we were very thankful for the outcome of so many of these battles.
Homeschoolers need to be continually vigilant because the freedoms that we have are the result of a court case which was interpreting a statute. The legislature could change that statute anytime it wants to and basically undercut the freedom that we won with so much effort and by the grace of God in the Leeper versus Arlington ISD. So constant vigilance is required.
But our children are our legacy, and there's nothing more important than making the decisions regarding their education, whether you choose to teach them yourself totally or whether you decide to farm out parts of their education to other people. The parent's right to make that decision is, I think, a sacred thing.
I hope we made a big difference. I hope that the homeschoolers of today never experience the fear and the worry that we went through. I hope they feel free to do what they feel is right as far as their children's education.